And we are back. I'm jumping around a little bit on my recording because I found out that the class that or the young man who emailed me, let me know that they were beginning Act 2 today. So, I have recorded a little bit of Act 1, but I'm going to see if I can get through all of Act 2. It's rather long. So, Act 2 of The Miracle Worker. It is evening. The only room visible in the Keller house is Annie's, where by lamplight Annie, in a shawl, is at a desk writing a letter. At her bureau, Helen, in her customary unkempt state, is tucking her doll in the bottom drawer as a cradle, the contents of which she has dumped out, creating, as usual, a fine disorder. Annie mutters each word as she writes her letter, slowly, her eyes close to and almost touching the page, to follow with difficulty her penwork. If you remember correctly, Annie Sullivan is partially or legally blind. Annie. And nobody here has attempted to control her. The greatest problem I have is how to discipline her without breaking her spirit. Resolute voice. But I shall insist on reasonable obedience from the start. At which point, Helen, groping about on the desk, knocks over the inkwell. Annie jumps up, rescues her letter, writes the inkwell, grabs a towel to stem the spillage, and then wipes at Helen's hands. Helen, as always, pulls free, but not until Annie first gets 3 letters into her palm. Ink. I-N-K. Helen is enough interested in and puzzled by this spelling that she proffers her hand again. So Annie spells and impassively dunks it back into the spillage. Ink. It has a name. She wipes the hand clean and leads Helen to her bureau, where she looks for something to engage her. She finds a sewing card with needle and thread, and going to her knees shows Helen's hand how to connect 1 row of holes. Down, under, up, and be careful of the needle. Helen gets it, and Annie rises. Fine. You keep out of the ink, and perhaps I can keep out of the soup. She returns to the desk, tidies it, and resumes writing her letter, bent close to the page. These blots are her handiwork. She's interrupted by a gasp. Helen has stuck her finger and sits sucking at it darkly. Then, with vengeful resolve, she seizes her doll and is about to dash its brains out on the floor when Annie, diving, catches it in one hand, which she at once shakes with hopping pain, but otherwise ignores patiently. All right, let's try temperance. Taking the doll, she kneels, goes through the motion of knocking its head on the floor, spells into Helen's hand. Bad girl. She lets Helen feel the grieved expression on her face. Helen imitates it. Next, she makes Helen caress the doll and kiss the hurt spot and hold it gently in her arms. Then spells into her hand, Good girl. She lets Helen feel the smile on her face. Helen sits with a scowl which suddenly clears. She pats the doll, kisses it, wreathes her face in a large artificial smile, and bears the doll to the washstand where she carefully sits it. Annie watches, pleased. Very good girl. Whereupon Helen elevates the pitcher and dashes it on the floor instead. Annie leaps to her feet and stands inarticulate. Helen calmly gropes back to sit to the sewing card and needle. Annie manages to achieve self-control. She picks up a fragment or two of the pitcher, sees Helen is puzzling over the card, and resolutely kneels to demonstrate it again. She spells into Helen's hand. Kate, meanwhile, comes around the corner with folded sheets on her arm, halts at the doorway, and watches them for a moment in silence. She is moved, but level. Kate, presently, what are you saying to her? Annie, glancing up, is a bit embarrassed and rises from the spelling to find her company manners. Oh, I was just making conversation, saying it was a sewing card. But does that, she imitates with her fingers, mean that to her? Annie, no, she won't know what spelling is till she knows what a word is. Yet you keep spelling to her. Why? I like to hear myself talk. The captain says it's like spelling to the fence post. Does he now? Is it? No, it's how I watch you talk to Mildred. Mildred? Any baby. Gibberish. Grown-up gibberish. Baby talk gibberish. Do they understand one word of it to start? Somehow they begin to. If they hear it, I'm letting Helen hear it. Other children are not impaired. Huh. There's nothing impaired in that head. It works like a mousetrap. Kate smiles. But after a child hears how many words, Miss Annie? 1,000,000? Annie, I guess. No mother's ever minded enough to count. She drops her eyes to spell into Helen's hand, again indicating the card. Helen spells back and Annie is amused. Kate, too quickly. What did she spell? Annie, I spelled card. She spelled cake. She takes in Kate's quickness and shakes her head gently. No, it's only a finger game to her, Mrs. Keller. What she has to learn first is that things have names. And when will she learn? Maybe after 1,000,001 words. They hold each other's gaze. Kate then speaks quietly. Kate, I should like to learn those letters, Miss Annie. Annie, pleased. I'll teach you tomorrow morning. That makes only 500,000 each. Kate, then, it's her bedtime. Annie reaches for the sewing card. Helen objects. Annie insists, and Helen gets rid of Annie's hand by jabbing it with the needle. Annie gasps and moves to grip Helen's wrist, but Kate intervenes with a proffered sweet, and Helen drops the card, crams the sweet into her mouth, and scrambles up to search her mother's hands for more. Annie nurses her wound, staring after the sweet. I'm sorry, Miss Annie. Annie indignantly. Why does she get a reward for stabbing me? Well, then tiredly, we catch our flies with honey, I'm afraid. We haven't had the heart for much else, and so many times she simply cannot be compelled. Annie ominous. Yes, I'm the same way myself. Kate smiles and leads Helen off around at the corner. Annie, alone in her room, picks up things and in the act of removing Helen's doll, gives way to unmannerly temptation. She throttles it. She drops it on her bed and stands pondering. Then she turns back, sits decisively, and writes again as the lights dim on her. Grimly, the more I think, the more certain I am that obedience is the gateway through which knowledge enters the mind of the child. On the word obedience, a shaft of sunlight hits the water pump outside, while Annie's voice ends in the dark, followed by a distant cockcrow. Daylight comes up over another corner of the sky, with Viney's voice heard at once. Breakfast ready! Viney comes down into the sunlight beam and pumps a pitcher full of water. While the pitcher's brimming, we hear conversation from the dark. The light grows to the family room at the house, where all are either entering or already seated at breakfast. With Keller and James arguing the war, Helen is wandering around the table to explore the contents of the other plates. When Annie is in her chair, she watches Helen Viney re-enters, sets the pitcher on the table. Kate lifts the almost empty biscuit place with an inquiring look. Viney nods and bears it off back, neither of them interrupting the men. Annie, meanwhile, sits with fork quiet, watching Helen, who at her mother's plate pokes her hand among some scrambled eggs. Kate catches Annie's eyes on her, smiles with a wry gesture. Helen moves on to James's plate, the male talk continuing. James, deferential, and Keller overriding. No, but shouldn't we give the devil his due, Father? The fact is, we lost the South 2 years earlier when he outthought us behind Vicksburg. Keller, outthought is a peculiar word for a butcher. James, harness maker, wasn't he? Keller, I said butcher. His only virtue as a soldier was numbers, and he led them to slaughter with no more regard than for so many sheep. James, but even if in that sense he was a butcher, the fact that he is, and a drunken one, half the war. Agreed, Father. If his own people said he was, I can't argue. Well, what is it you find to admire in such a man, Jimmy? The butchery or the drunkenness? Neither, Father. Only the fact that he beat us. He didn't. Is it your contention we won the war, sir? Keller, he didn't beat us at Vicksburg. We lost Vicksburg because Pemberton gave Bragg 5,000 of his cavalry, and Loring, whom I knew personally for a nincompoop before you were born, marched away from Champion's Hill with enough men to have held them. We lost Vicksburg by stupidity, verging on treason. I would have said we lost Vicksburg because Grant was the one thing no Yankee general was before him. Keller. Drunk? I doubt it. Obstinate. Obstinate. Could any of them compare even in that with old Stonewall? If he'd been there, we would still have Vicksburg. James. Well, the butcher simply wouldn't give up. He tried 4 ways of getting around Vicksburg, and on the 5th try, he got around. Anyone else would have pulled north, and he wouldn't have got around if we'd had a Southerner in command instead of a half-breed Yankee trader like Pemberton. While this background talk is in progress, Helen is working around the table, ultimately toward Anne's plate. She messes with her hands in James's plate, then in Keller's, both men taking it so for granted they hardly notice. Then Helen comes, groping with soiled hands past her own plate to Annie's. Her hand goes to it, and Annie, who's been waiting, deliberately lifts and removes her hand. Helen gropes again. Annie firmly pins her by the wrist and removes her hand from the table. Helen thrusts her hands again. Annie catches them, and Helen begins to flail and make noises. The interruption brings Keller's gaze upon them. What's the matter there? Kate. Miss Annie, you see, she's accustomed to helping herself from our place to anything she... Yes, but I'm not accustomed to it. Well, of course not. Barney. Kate. Give her something, Jimmy, to quiet her. James blandly. But her table manners are the best she has. Well, he pokes across with a chunk of bacon at Helen's hand, which Annie releases. But Helen knocks the bacon away and stubbornly thrusts at Annie's plate. Annie grips her wrists again. The struggle mounts. Keller. Let her this time, Miss Sullivan. It's the only way we get any adult conversation. If my son half merits that description. He rises. I'll get you another plate. Annie gripping Helen. I have a plate, thank you. Kate calling. Barney, I'm afraid what Captain Keller says is only too true. She'll persist in this until she gets her own way. Keller at the door. Barney, bring Miss Sullivan another plate. Annie stonily. I have a plate. Nothing's wrong with the plate. I intend to keep it. Silence for a moment, except for Helen's noises as she struggles to get loose. The Kellers are a bit nonplussed, and Annie is too darkly intent on Helen's manners to have any thoughts now of her own. James. Ha! You see why they took Vicksburg? Keller, uncertainly. Miss Sullivan. One plate or another is hardly a matter to struggle with a deprived child about. Annie. Oh, I'd sooner have a more... Helen begins to kick. Annie moves her ankles to the opposite side of the chair. Have a more heroic issue myself. Keller. No. Really, I must insist. You... Helen bangs her toe on the chair and sinks to the floor, crying with rage and feigned injury. Annie keeps hold of her wrist, gazing down, while Kate rises. Now she's hurt herself. Annie. No, she hasn't. Will you please let her hands go? Miss Annie, you don't know the child well enough yet. She'll keep... I know, an ordinary tantrum. Well enough. when I see one, and a badly spoiled child. Here, here. Here, James. Keller, very annoyed. Miss Sullivan, you would have more understanding of your pupil if you had some pity in you. Now kindly do as I... Pity? She releases Helen to turn equally and annoyed on Keller across the table. Instantly. I love the picture. Instantly, Helen scrambles up and dives at Annie's plate. This time, Annie intercepts her by pouncing on her wrists like a hawk, and her temper boils. For this tyrant, the whole house turns on her whims. Is there anything she wants she doesn't get? I'll tell you what I pity, that the sun won't rise and set for her all her life. And every day you're telling her it will. What good will your pity do her when you're under the strawberries, Captain Keller? Keller, outraged. Kate, for the love of heaven, will you... Miss Annie, please, I don't think it serves to lose our... It does you good, that's all. It's less trouble to feel sorry for her than to teach her anything better, isn't it? I fail to see where you have taught her anything yet, Miss Sullivan. I'll begin this minute, if you'll leave the room, Captain Keller. Leave the... Everyone, please. She struggles with Helen, while Keller endeavors to control his voice. Miss Sullivan, you are here only as a paid teacher, nothing more, and not to lecture. I can't unteach her 6 years of pity if you can't stand up to one tantrum. Old Stonewall indeed, Mrs. Keller. You promised me help. Indeed I did. We truly want to. Then leave me alone with her now. Keller, in a wrath. Katie, will you come outside with me at once, please? He marches to the front door. And Katie and James follow him. Simultaneously, Annie releases Helen's wrists, and the child again sinks to the floor, kicking and crying her weird noises. Annie steps over to her to meet Viney, coming in the rear doorway with biscuits and a clean plate, surprised at the general commotion. Heaven's sakes! Annie, out, please. She backs Viney out with one hand, closes the door on her astonished mouth, locks it, and removes the key. Keller, meanwhile, snatches his hat from a rack, and Kate follows him down the porch steps. James lingers in the doorstep to address Annie across the room with a bow. If it takes all summer, General. Annie comes over to his door in turn, removing her glasses grimly. As Keller outside begins speaking, Annie closes the door on James, locks it, removes the key, and turns with her back against the door to stare ominously at Helen, kicking on the floor. James takes his hat from the rack and, going down the porch steps, joins Kate and Keller talking in the yard. Keller in a sputter of ire. This cub of a girl presumes... I'll tell you, I'm a half a mind to ship her back to Boston before the week is out. You can inform her so from me. Eyebrows up. I, Captain? Keller. She's a hireling. Now I want it clear, unless there's an apology and complete change of manner, she goes back on the next train. Will you make that quite clear? Kate. Where will you be, Captain, while I'm making it quite? Keller. At the office. He begins off left, finds his napkin still in his irate hand, is uncertain with it, dabs his lips with dignity, gets rid of it in a toss to James, and marches off. James turns to eye Kate. James, will you? Kate's mouth is set, and James studies it lightly. I thought what she said was exceptionally intelligent. I've been saying it for years. Kate, not without scorn. To his face? She comes to relieve him of the white napkin, but reverts again with it. Oh, will you take it, Jimmy, as a flag? James stalks out, much offended, and Kate, turning, stares across the yard at the house. The lights narrowing down to the following pantomime in the family room leave her motionless in the dark. Annie, meanwhile, has begun by slapping both keys down on a shelf, out of Helen's reach. She returns to the table upstage. Helen's kicking has subsided, and when from the floor her hand finds Annie's chair empty, she pauses. Annie clears the table of Kate's, James's, and Keller's plates. She gets back to her own across the table, just in time to slide it deftly away from Helen's pouncing hand. She lifts the hand and moves it to Helen's plate, and after an instant's exploration, Helen sits again on the floor and drums her heels. Annie comes around the table and resumes her chair. When Helen feels her skirt again, she ceases kicking, waits for whatever is to come, renews some kicking, waits again. Annie, retrieving her plate, takes up a forkful of food, stops it halfway to her mouth, gazes at it, devoid of appetite, and half follows it. But after a look at Helen, she sighs, dips the forkful toward Helen in a for your sake toast, and puts it in her own mouth to chew, not without an effort. So she's like, here's to ya. She's saluting or toasting to Helen. Helen now gets a hold of the chair leg, and half succeeds in pulling the chair out from under her. Annie bangs it down with her rear heavily and sits with all her weight. Helen's next attempt to topple it is unavailing, so her fingers dive in a pinch at Annie's flank. Annie, in the middle of her mouthful, almost loses it with a startle, and she slaps down her fork to round on Helen. The child comes up with curiosity to feel what Anne is doing. So Annie resumes eating, letting Helen's hand follow the movement of her fork to her mouth. Whereupon, Helen at once reaches into Annie's plate. Annie firmly removes her hand to her own plate. Helen, in reply, pinches Annie's thigh. A good mean pinchful that makes Annie jump. Annie sets the fork down and sits with her mouth tight. Helen digs another pinch into her thigh, and this time Annie slaps her hand smartly away. Helen retaliates with a roundhouse fist that catches Annie on the ear, and Annie's hand leaps at once in a forceful slap across Helen's cheek. Helen is the startled one now. Annie's hand, in compunction, falters to her own face. But when Helen hits at her again, Annie deliberately slaps her again. Helen lifts her fist irresolute for another roundhouse. Annie lifts her hand resolute for another slap, and they freeze in this posture while Helen mulls it over. So she's standing there thinking about it. She thinks better of it, drops her fist, and giving Annie a wide berth, gropes around to her mother's chair to find it empty. She blunders her way along the table upstage, and encountering the empty chairs and missing plates, she looks bewildered, and she gropes back to her mother's chair, again touches her cheek and indicates the chair, and waits for the world to answer. So I am going to stop there for today. So let me make a note that I'm going to stop right here. We're going to find out how this confrontation resolves itself next time. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up His countenance upon you and grant you His peace.